All right, so today's optional lecture is going to be on mocking a third-party API in local development. And so what this means is, let's say you have an application and you want to hit an actual third-party API, as we're, that's kind of part of the project. So you want to, you have a weather API that you want to get information from. So when you're developing that locally, you can hit the real weather API, and that's fine, but it's not ideal. It's not ideal for a couple reasons. One is that if you're messing with a credential that maybe you risk accidentally checking it in or doing something like that, because you're using it as you're developing locally and you've got lots of other things you're worried about. That's one thing. The other thing is, if you have request limits, if you're using like a free tier of the API, maybe you only have a certain number of requests, and as you're developing locally, there's some risk of using up all your requests. This can also happen with like React, where you get into like an infinite state change kind of loop. So you can end up making thousands of requests without even realizing it, just in a few seconds. So yeah, in order to avoid that and to basically more tightly control your environment. So if you're doing unit tests, then you can mock all this other stuff, right? These other like effectful things. These things that have, like talking to a database or making a request to an API. You can mock those in unit tests, but if you want to do like a local end-to-end test, like actually run your entire application and walk through it and make sure everything is working, then you can't really do that so easily. So you have to take a different approach to that. And I think basically standard approach is to have another Docker container that's running a mock version, some limited version of the API that you want to hit. So I have that going here. So I'm just going to walk through this example. Over here, this is the dev API branch, but I'm going to check this out. Pull it down. And I'm going to check out the dev API branch. So git checkout. All right. So this is the same old wine API app, just with a slight modification. And the modification here is that anytime you save a wine to the database, it's going to make a third-party API call to get an image URL to associate with that wine. So that's just an example. It could be anything. But so I'll just check out the code here. This is all happening in serializers. And it's happening here because it's not really a part of it's not something that the client is going to send you. So this is something that's automatically generated. So a new wine gets created, and then automatically, without the user's involvement, we get some piece of information and then associate that. So that's right here. This is the image URL that we're going to have, and we're going to use the URL field. So this is added to the model. And then in serializers, we're just going to bypass the views because we don't need to do anything there. So in the serializers, we have this method that we're going to call, which is just going to, hit this third-party API that we have. So there's nothing special. I'm using the requests library in Python. I'm just going to make a GET request to whatever this URL is. And then I'm including this token. This token is not actually used by this API, but I'm just including this as a, as an example, because you'll probably have to use something like that. Okay, and then when the wine instance is created, so this create method, we're going to add some stuff. So we've got, we're basically just going to create the wine object. And then we have to go through this convoluted process, unfortunately, because we're gonna fetch this wine image based on the ID of the wine. So this is an arbitrary example, but in this case, that's what we have to do. And we don't know what the ID is of the wine object is going to be until we save it to the database, right? Because that primary key, the ID field, is generated automatically by the database. So we can't know in advance what that's going to be. So we have to save it first, and then we have to fetch it again, and then we can grab the ID from there, and that's what we send as a parameter to this get thumbnail URL method, which is going to return that. So let me just go there so you can see what that looks like. I forget which endpoint this was. It's actually, let me go look here real quick. So this is the API, and we'll go to /1, for example. So this is the piece of information that our application needs. So we go here and we grab this, and then we save this as part of the wine object. Okay. So we're doing that, and then we grab that, and then we add this field. So it's null initially when it gets saved, and then we basically update it with this URL, and then we save it again. So that's what's happening on the back end. The tricky part is right here, basically. So we need to go to a URL to get this photo ID, but we don't want to hard code. You don't want to hard code the actual production version of this. So we need to have this be configurable depending on whether it's running in development locally or in production on an EC2 instance. So that's something that you're basically going to control with configuration, and the typical way we've been doing that is by using an environment variable. So we're going to create an environment variable right here, and we're going to inject those when we run the containers. So we can look at that right here. So settings, my photo URL. That's right here. So we're just grabbing whatever these are. They're going to get picked up from the environment, just like just like this, just like your secret key or your debug or anything else you have. Okay, so your application code right here is going to get this from settings, and your settings is going to get this from an environment variable, and the environment variable is going to come from the Docker compose file. So we added these two new values in the environment. So when Docker compose runs the containers, it will inject these values into the container at runtime. And then we have to keep following the chain. So where are we going to get these actual values from? Well, we're going to get them from the run scripts. So when we actually run the compose files, we're going to inject these values that you'll pass in as parameters. So that's the basic structure of what we're doing. And then if you look at the dev compose file, we have this extra container, this extra service we're gonna have, which I'm just calling dummy photos. So you can take a look at that. So this is going to mock this. So this is a real server. You can really hit it and get a real response. But we need to mock that locally, and that's what we're going to do here. So this dummy photos container that is right here, and the Docker file for that, I'll show you the actual. So here's a very simple, maybe as simple as possible server. So this is a Flask server. You could use whatever you want. I just use Flask because it's probably the simplest thing. And we have just one route. If your application needs multiple routes, then you'll have to create multiple routes. But in this case, we just need to get this image, this image URL. So for any ID, it's just going to be the same. If you need to vary that, you can implement that logic here, but this is the simplest possible case. So anytime someone goes to this route, they're going to get this thing. So that's pretty much it. So we've just created a server that's going to run, and anytime it gets a request to whatever / some ID, it's going to return this. And then the Docker file, it's just the same old stuff. It's using Flask, so it needs Python. And we'll install the requirements, which are the requirements for Flask. And then it's just going to run. So when the container gets executed, it's going to run this server script. So the server is going to sit there, wait for requests, and respond. And so this Docker compose file is going to manage that. It's going to build the image right there in dummy photos service. And we're going to, you don't have to do this, but we're going to open port 8000. We're going to map port 8001 on the host machine, just so you can do any debugging that you need to do. So the reason why you would expose a port, it's the same thing here. The reason we're exposing these ports is just for local development, so you can directly interact with the API service or this dummy API service. But in production, first off, in production, this isn't going to be there, and this is also not going to be there because everything is going to go through the Nginx container. So everything goes in through port 80 on the Nginx container, and then the Nginx container will route traffic from there. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so there's a number of different things happening here. So let's spin it up and we'll see it in action. All right, so I'm gonna close out of this stuff, and I'm just gonna run this locally. So I'm gonna execute the run compose dev script. So /run compose dev, and I need to pass it 2 parameters. I'm not actually using this API key, so it doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. And then this photo URL. So for development, it's going to have to be HTTP dummy photos. And let me just go back here to this code. So this base URL is going to be, when we're running it locally, it's going to be http:/dummy_photos. Why is it going to be dummy photos? So why is this URL going to be, because this doesn't look like a normal URL to me.
Because it's calling a file?
No, it's not calling a file.
Oh, is that the name of the service?
Yes, exactly. So dummy photos is the arbitrary name that we gave this service. So we look at the settings. Where's this coming from?
The Docker file.
Yeah, it's coming from right here. It's coming from the compose file. So this is the name that we're giving it. So this host is actually a URL. And Docker will resolve this name to an actual IP address on the Docker network. So this is actually going to be an IP address. And if you'll see, on the job, if you have a database running, your database is going to be on a server somewhere, and it'll have an IP address, and that's how you'll know, where it is. Host and port. So, this is an HTTP thing. So DB comes from here. So internally, this will get resolved to an IP address, and same thing with API, and same thing with this right here. So that's why we're going to use dummy photos, because it's going to resolve to this, and this is going to be just sitting there running. If you look at the code again for that server, this is going to be sitting there running basically on localhost port 80. So it's going to be running, listening for requests on port 80. And we're going to map, externally this, but internally, this is going to be dummy photos, and implicitly it's going to be port 80, because that's the default HTTP port. So this can directly communicate with this service inside of that Docker network where all your containers are running. All right, so let's go ahead and run this, and I'm going to copy this. Let's go ahead just to get that ready. We should be running the migrations in a second. And I'm also preloading this with some dummy data. That's what this last line is doing. All right, so now if I go to localhost port 80, this is where the Nginx container is running. So I can go to list wines, and I have these 3 dummy wines that I preloaded. And I should be able to create a new wine. And I'm going to open the network tab here. Okay, so I'm just going to create a wine. And What is that logo? So anyway, it made a request to this, and we can look at the request. So it went to localhost/API. And we can't see the actual request that went to our server, but we should actually be able to see the logs. So if I do docker ps, get all these containers. So here's the dummy photos service. So I'm gonna get the logs for this and see if that showed up. So docker logs. Yeah. So here is that request. So I made a get request here. So that container is dummy photos service received that request. So if we go here to list wines now, we have this additional wine, and all of them are going to have the same image because that's what we're returning. So if I create another one and then list wines, it's all of them are going to have this because we're just returning that single JSON object every time. Okay, so let's say we're having some kind of problem with this. We need to debug. Because in development, we're going to map port 8001. We can go to this port and directly check this just to make sure that it's actually doing what we think it's doing. So I can go to localhost 8001. And I should just, so one, so this is /ID, looking at the code again for the dummy server. So /ID, so we'll just give it some number. Doesn't matter what number we give it. And this is the response we're getting. So if there was a problem, we could double check here and directly interact with the API container and make sure it's responding the way we expect. So that helps you eliminate, reduce the problem space domain if you're having an issue. So now we're sure that this API is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So if there's still a problem, it's probably in the front end or something. Okay, so that's how. So we're not using our actual production. We're not dwindling down our free requests per month or whatever. So this is like totally local. It doesn't matter. You can make 1 million requests here and you're not going to get blacklisted or charged a bunch of money or anything like that. Okay. Questions about that? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and deploy this now. So let me just sign into AWS. Okay, so I'm going to create an EC2 instance. I'm going to reuse this. I'm actually just going to reuse a security group. So you can create a new one. And I'll launch that. Okay, and while that launches, or actually I'm going to go here. I need to get the IP address of this container. So I'm going to copy that. So now I'm going to go push up my images. So I want to create a release. So my code is good, it's working locally. I'm going to stop this. And then I'm going to go to push it up. So build and push images. Yeah, so I'm going to push all this up. This actually doesn't need to change because the URL that we're getting here is just injected at runtime. The reason we have to include this here is because the React has to get built with this in it. So the React app has to get built. So we build it and then we put it in the container and then we push it up. So the React stuff's a little bit different. And please note that this is not a this is not a credential. This is not something that's a secret. This is just the server endpoint. All right, so let's run this / build and push images, and the base URL is going to be that, and then the version number, whatever, I'll just say 9.1. So for the version number, you would actually want to keep track and have something sensible. All right, so that's going to get built and pushed. Meanwhile, this should be good now. So I can go start getting this set up. So I'm going to first open up a new terminal. Put this in there temporarily. And then I'm going to SSH in. Yes, it works. Okay. And then I'm going to copy these files over. This will be SCP. And the files that I want, I need those 3 files. I need the setup EC2. I need the run compose prod, and I need the Docker compose prod. So I'm going to push all that stuff up. I need to supply the path, which is going to be :home/ec2-user. Okay, so those files copied successfully, so I can go back into the container, or sorry, go back into the EC2 instance. And for some reason, let's try that again. Where's that? This here. Okay, not sure why that wasn't working, but there we go. So I'm gonna install Docker and everything. So I'm gonna run the setup script. And I'll just double check that the images actually got pushed. Okay, so I can also go to my Docker Hub account. Just real quick. Okay, so here are the containers. So if I go here to the API prod one, I've got a bunch of different versions. So this is what yours should look like when you've been working on this for a little while. Just a bunch of different versions that you've pushed up. So the most recent one, the one that I'm targeting right now is 9.1. If I deploy 9.1 and it doesn't work, I can always just revert to the last one. If I'm sure that this one worked and this is broken, I can just revert back a version. Okay, so that's, I know that the image is up there now. And I can go here and I can run the, let me go here. I'm just gonna look at the script so I know what to provide it. Okay, so I have to run the prod deploy script with these variables passed in. So / run blah blah blah, secret key, yeah, whatever your secret key is, debug, false, Postgres DB, yeah, whatever you want to put here. And then the version is going to be 9.1. And then the API key, again, we're not actually using that. And then the photo URL. So we need to use the actual, the actual endpoint here. So we're going to include that right there. Then we can execute this. See if the migrations run. Okay, so everything looks good there. So I'm going to grab the IP address. Here. So there we go. So I'm going to list lines. There are none. So this is production. So I'm not using dummy data, although you could use dummy data in production if you want. And then I'm going to create a line and list them. And it gets this thing. So I'll just create a few just so you can see that they're all going to be different. So I'm hitting the new endpoint. All right, so if I list them, I can see that they're all here. These are all hitting the actual endpoint now. So that's it. I mean, it's not free. There's definitely some complexity there, but this is how you would handle that in a an actual code base, because you wouldn't hit an actual API, like an actual production API, when you're developing. So this kind of thing is realistically how you would separate your different environments.
So just so I'm on the same page, this is mainly for testing, so you can see exactly how many times the separate server hits the API, your third-party API.
Yeah, it's for testing, and one, it's good to keep every, like, you'll typically have multiple environments where your application will run. Like, you have a local development, you might have like a staging environment, and then you might have a pre-production environment and then a production environment. So you can have lots of different environments. We're just using two, which is development and then production, but you can have all kinds of them depending on what exactly you want to test. So for example, you might have like a pre-production branch which uses production data, but maybe a subset of it, and run. So, like people can, you can develop a new feature and then you can test it in this one. Okay, it works. Let's move it up to like, it's kind of like promoting the code. So you can check things and like solve, catch bugs and stuff like that. And then you actually release it to prod, and then there's still gonna be bugs, but hopefully fewer.
Okay, because I'm just thinking from my situation, I have my API in my view, one view class in Django,
Mhm.
and then I just check it on the front end for like data and stuff. So
So so in your view, you're calling another API.
yes.
Okay, yeah. So that's something that, I mean, you could definitely mock using a pattern like this.
Okay.
Where so locally you develop, so you're not actually hitting like the real API that you're going to use. You can figure out, like I did, a very simple example of just returning, the same thing every time. But to be useful for your use case, you may need to do something slightly more complicated. But you shouldn't need to like actually implement the full API of whatever service you're using. Just enough to be useful when you're testing it locally.
Okay.
Did that answer your question? I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just calling my third party from that view, like the main, and then whatever request I get from the front end, I put into my view. And then that full URL is what I call from my view as a post. And then I return that back to the front end.
So you actually you pass the actual URL to the front end, and then the front end makes the call to that endpoint.
No, so the URL, the main base URL is in my Django view, and then the link that's generated on the front end are the user inputs sent to that view, and then it processes it right there.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely fine. You can still do that and then still mock the actual third-party API. So you can still do whatever processing that you usually do in the view. So I don't think you would need to change that. I can take a look at the specific case you're talking about.
Okay.
You shouldn't need to change the logic in the actual view itself.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's all I got for that. Let me stop this.